It was supposed to be a casual lunch with friends on a beautiful June afternoon in Florida. Madison Shemetz, just 17 years old, was looking forward to good food and company at a popular restaurant in Ponte Vedra Beach. But as she and her mother prepared to leave, Madison noticed someone she never wanted to see again, her ex-boyfriend, sitting nearby, watching. What happened next would change her life forever, leaving her fighting not just for survival, but for the ability to ever walk again. This is the story of Madison Shemetz, a story of terror, heroism, and a recovery that doctors called nothing short of miraculous. Madison Shemetz was a typical American teenager growing up in Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida. She attended Ponte Vedra High School, where she was known as a friendly, outgoing student with a bright future ahead. Like many teenagers, Madison experienced the ups and downs of first relationships. In late 2022, Madison began dating Spencer Pearson. For approximately 6 months, the two spent time together as many teenage couples do. To outside observers, they seemed like any other young couple navigating high school romance. But by April 2023, Madison had made a decision. The relationship wasn't healthy. Something wasn't right. At just 17 years old, she did what many people twice her age struggle to do. She ended the relationship and walked away. What Madison couldn't have known was that her decision would trigger a descent into obsession and violence that would nearly cost her everything. Spencer Pearson did not accept the breakup. For the next 2 months, from April through early June, Pearson engaged in a relentless campaign of stalking and harassment. He bombarded Madison with messages on social media. He showed up places where he knew she would be. He made it clear through his actions that he had no intention of letting Madison move on with her life. The harassment escalated to the point where Madison and her family became genuinely concerned for her safety. This wasn't just a broken-hearted teenager. This was someone whose behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and threatening. Madison confided in friends about her fears. Her mother, Jacqueline Roger, was aware of the situation and deeply worried. In late April, Pearson's mental state deteriorated further. He posted a disturbing photo on Snapchat showing a necktie around his neck with tears streaming down his face, seemingly simulating suicide. The post alarmed everyone who saw it. It was a cry for help, a manipulation tactic, or perhaps both. A warning sign that Pearson was spiraling into a dangerous psychological state. Pearson's family recognized their son was in crisis. They took him for evaluation and treatment. He was hospitalized for 5 days in April, receiving psychiatric care for what his family described as severe depression, social anxiety, and autism. His parents watched helplessly as their son struggled with emotional turmoil they couldn't control. But hospitalization didn't resolve the underlying issues. When Pearson was released, the obsession with Madison remained. If anything, it had intensified. He continued to follow her movements and make his presence known in increasingly unsettling ways. Madison tried to go about her normal life. She spent time with friends, went to school, looked forward to her senior year, but there was always an undercurrent of unease, a nagging worry about what her ex-boyfriend might do next. That worry would prove tragically well-founded. On the afternoon of June 3, 2023, Madison made plans to meet her mother and friends for lunch at Mr. Chubby's Wings, a casual restaurant in Ponte Vedra Beach. It was meant to be an enjoyable afternoon, nothing special, just quality time with people she cared about. Madison and Jacqueline arrived and settled in with their group. The conversation flowed easily, the food was good, and for a while, It seemed perfectly ordinary. Madison felt relaxed and happy in a crowded public place. But approximately 30 minutes into their meal, everything changed. Madison's eyes fell on a figure across the restaurant, and her heart sank. Spencer Pearson was there, sitting at a table, watching her. His presence was no coincidence. Surveillance cameras inside the restaurant captured what happened next. The footage showed Pearson walking near Madison's table as soon as he entered, making his presence unmistakably known. Madison's reaction was visible even on grainy footage. She appeared shocked and frightened. Madison and Jacqueline exchanged worried glances. They had discussed this scenario before. What to do if Pearson showed up? The answer was simple. Leave immediately. Don't engage. Get to safety. Madison's friend Casey Estep, who was with them, later described how Madison and her mother suddenly said they had to go, right away. There was no mistaking the urgency in their voices or the fear in their eyes. They asked for the check quickly, trying not to draw attention to their hasty departure. Madison's pulse raced as she gathered her things. The goal was to leave quietly and avoid confrontation. They would get to the parking lot, get in the car, and drive away. It was a reasonable plan. It should have worked. But as surveillance footage later revealed, Pearson watched from his position near a window, tracking their movements. The moment Madison and Jacqueline stepped outside into the bright Florida sunshine, Pearson bolted from his seat and ran after them. What happened in that parking lot was an explosion of violence so sudden and brutal that witnesses struggled to process what they were seeing. Pearson came at Madison from behind with a large folding knife that had been given to him by his parents. Even engraved with his personal information, he forced Madison to the ground and began stabbing her with terrifying ferocity. The attack was relentless, methodical, meant to kill. Pearson stabbed Madison 17 times, targeting her neck, back, and torso. Each thrust of the blade was an attempt to end her life. Madison screamed. Witnesses froze in horror. And Jacqueline Roget, faced with every parent's worst nightmare, did what any mother would do. She threw herself into the fray to save her daughter's life. Jacqueline lunged at Pearson, trying to pull him off Madison. She grabbed at him, struck at him, used her own body to shield her daughter. Pearson turned the knife on her, stabbing Jacqueline in the forehead, hand, and leg. Blood poured from her wounds, but she didn't stop fighting. She continued to grapple with Pearson, desperately trying to give Madison a chance to survive. The attack might have continued until both women were dead, if not for Kennedy Armstrong, a 22-year-old restaurant manager who had just pulled into the parking lot. Armstrong heard the screams and didn't hesitate. He sprinted 160 feet across the parking lot and tackled Pearson to the ground with full force. The impact separated Pearson from his victims, but the danger wasn't over. Pearson tried to get back up, still holding the knife. Armstrong jumped on him again, pinning Pearson's arms down to prevent him from continuing the attack. For crucial seconds, Armstrong held Pearson down. As Armstrong briefly glanced toward the victims to assess their condition, Pearson made one final horrifying move. He began slitting his own throat with the knife. Bystanders rushed forward and wrestled the knife away before he could inflict fatal injuries on himself. The parking lot had become a scene of carnage. Madison lay bleeding from 17 stab wounds, her life hanging by a thread. Jacqueline was injured but conscious, her maternal instinct having overridden self-preservation. Armstrong nursed an injured hand where Pearson had cut him, nerve damage that would require multiple surgeries. And Pearson lay on the ground with self-inflicted throat wounds. Surrounded by the destruction his obsession had wrought, emergency services arrived within minutes. Paramedics immediately went to work on Madison, whose injuries were catastrophic. She had been stabbed in the back, and the blade had penetrated her spinal cord. As medical personnel rushed to stabilize her for transport, the terrible reality set in. Even if Madison survived, her life would never be the same. Madison Shemitz was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The 17 stab wounds had caused massive trauma, but it was the spinal cord injury that represented the most devastating consequence. The doctors delivered news that crushed Madison's family. She was paralyzed from the chest down. The blade had severed the neural pathways that allowed her brain to communicate with the lower half of her body. For a teenage girl who had been active and independent just hours before, the diagnosis was incomprehensible. Madison would never walk again. She would never run, never dance, never experience the simple joy of moving through the world on her own 2 feet. Her senior year of high school, which should have been filled with proms and college applications, would instead be consumed by hospitals, rehabilitation, and learning to navigate a world suddenly made inaccessible. The physical injuries were severe enough. Madison underwent emergency surgery and began the painful process of healing from multiple knife wounds. But the psychological trauma ran even deeper. She had been betrayed by someone she once trusted, hunted down in a public parking lot, and subjected to attempted murder in broad daylight. The sense of safety that most people take for granted had been violently ripped away. Jacqueline Roget recovered from her physical injuries, the stab wounds to her forehead, hand, and leg, but the emotional scars would last much longer. She had fought to protect her daughter, yet she hadn't been able to prevent the catastrophic spinal injury. The guilt and trauma of that day would haunt her. Kennedy Armstrong also faced a long recovery. The nerve damage to his hand required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. His quick thinking and bravery had undoubtedly saved Madison's life. Had he not tackled Pearson when he did, the attack would have continued until Madison was dead. Yet Armstrong bore both physical and emotional scars from those terrifying minutes. As news of the attack spread, the community rallied around the Shemitz family. A GoFundMe campaign was established to help with mounting medical expenses. Friends organized vigils. The outpouring of support was overwhelming, but it couldn't change the fundamental reality. Madison's life had been forever altered by senseless violence. Spencer Pearson survived his self-inflicted wounds and was arrested. He was charged with 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder and 1 count of aggravated battery causing serious bodily injury. The evidence was overwhelming: surveillance footage, eyewitness testimony, and the knife itself. But for the Shemitz family, the criminal charges were secondary to the daily struggle of rebuilding their lives. Madison faced months of intensive physical therapy, learning to use a wheelchair, adapting to a body that no longer responded as it once had. Every day brought new challenges, new frustrations, new moments of grief for the life she had lost. Doctors told Madison what she already knew but couldn't accept. The paralysis was permanent. There was no surgery that could repair a severed spinal cord. She would be in a wheelchair for the rest of her life, dependent on others for basic tasks. Forever marked by the violence Pearson had inflicted, Madison had every reason to give up, to sink into despair, to rage against the unfairness. No one would have blamed her for surrendering to darkness, but Madison Shemitz was made of stronger stuff than anyone realized, perhaps even stronger than she realized herself. What happened over the next 11 months defied medical expectations and inspired everyone who witnessed it. Madison Shemitz, the teenage girl who had been told she would never walk again, decided that wasn't good enough. She would prove the doctors wrong. She would stand up. She would walk. And she would do it before graduation. The rehabilitation process was grueling beyond imagination. Every day, Madison worked with physical therapists, pushing her body to absolute limits and beyond. The pain was excruciating. The progress was maddeningly slow, measured in millimeters. There were setbacks and plateaus, moments when further recovery seemed impossible. But Madison refused to quit. She drew strength from her mother, who had literally put her own body between Madison and a knife-wielding attacker. She drew inspiration from Kennedy Armstrong, who had risked his life for a stranger without hesitation. And she drew determination from somewhere deep within herself, a well of resilience she didn't know existed. Slowly, impossibly, Madison began to regain function. It started with tiny movements, a toe wiggle, a slight muscle contraction. Physical therapists worked with her for hours each day, stimulating muscles, encouraging neural pathways to find new routes around damaged areas. Medical professionals watched her progress with amazement. This wasn't supposed to happen. Severed spinal cords don't heal. Paralyzed teenagers don't walk again. But Madison was rewriting the rules. Month by month, her strength returned. First, she could move her legs slightly. Then she could stand with assistance. Then she could take a step, then two, then more. The wheelchair that had seemed permanent became something she used less frequently. Physical therapy sessions that had once left her exhausted began yielding visible, measurable results. Her doctors called it remarkable. Her physical therapist called it extraordinary. Her family called it a miracle. Madison called it the hardest thing she'd ever done, and the most important. On her graduation day in May 2024, just under a year after the attack that left her paralyzed, Madison Shemitz walked across the stage to receive her diploma from Ponte Vedra High School. She walked on her own 2 feet, without assistance, her head held high and her smile radiant. The auditorium erupted in applause. Students, teachers, and parents who knew her story rose in a standing ovation that seemed endless. Many had tears streaming down their faces, overwhelmed by witnessing such a profound demonstration of human determination. Madison's walk across that stage was more than personal triumph. It was a statement. It was proof that violence doesn't have to have the final word. It was evidence that the human spirit can overcome even the most devastating trauma. It was hope, embodied in the determined steps of a teenage girl who refused to let her attacker define her life. While Madison worked on her recovery, the criminal case moved forward. In July 2024, more than a year after the attack, Pearson changed his plea from not guilty to guilty on all charges. The sentencing hearing in November 2024 was packed with family, friends, supporters, and media. The case had drawn significant national attention as people followed Madison's remarkable recovery. Pearson's defense attorneys argued for leniency, pointing to their client's mental health struggles, his youth, his lack of prior violent history, and his diagnosed conditions including depression, anxiety, and autism. They asked Judge Arlie Smith to consider going below the minimum sentence, suggesting Pearson required specialized treatment rather than life in prison. Judge Smith listened carefully, acknowledging that Pearson was suffering from mental health issues and that his age and history were factors worth considering. But then the victims spoke, and their words painted a devastating picture of lasting impact. Madison addressed the court directly, describing the moment she realized she was paralyzed, a memory that would haunt her forever. She spoke about months of excruciating rehabilitation, the daily pain, the simple activities she could no longer do. She described receiving what she called her own life sentence from Pearson, and pleaded with the judge to give Pearson the same life sentence he had given her. Jacqueline Roget spoke about the terror of watching her daughter being stabbed, the desperation of fighting to save her child, and the ongoing trauma. She described nightmares, hypervigilance, and how the attack fundamentally changed how she moved through the world. Kennedy Armstrong spoke about his decision to intervene, his injuries, and his anger at watching Pearson destroy a young woman's future over an inability to accept a breakup. Pearson himself took the stand to apologize, expressing what he claimed was sincere remorse. He acknowledged that June 3rd was the worst day in the victims' lives and said it was also the worst day of his. But Judge Smith made clear that remorse could not outweigh the severity of the crime and its lasting impact. The judge stated that certain crimes merit the maximum possible sentence, and this was one of them. He noted that without Armstrong's intervention and Jacqueline's protective actions, Pearson would have succeeded in killing Madison. The judge highlighted a particularly chilling detail. Madison had tried to help Pearson during his earlier suicide crisis, showing compassion for someone struggling, and that same person later violently attacked her. Judge R. Lee Smith sentenced Spencer Pearson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Pearson's family cried out in despair, while the Skemet's family shared hugs of relief. After 538 days of waiting, they finally had justice. Shortly after sentencing, Madison and Jacqueline filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages from Pearson, his parents, and Mr. Chubby's Wings restaurant. The lawsuit alleged that Pearson's parents knew their son had mental health issues and gave him the knife used in the attack despite his condition. It also alleged the restaurant failed to provide adequate security and didn't call police when Madison and her mother expressed fear and urgency about Pearson's presence. The civil case put focus on how violence often results from multiple failures that compound into tragedy. Today, Madison Shemitz continues her recovery and advocacy. Physical therapy never truly ends. Maintaining her mobility requires ongoing effort that will continue for life. The psychological impact will likely never fully fade. There are still nightmares, still moments of fear, still days when the weight feels crushing. But there are also moments of joy, accomplishment, and hope. Madison's story has touched countless people who draw inspiration from her refusal to be defined by what was done to her. She has shown that survival is not the same as recovery, and recovery is not the same as thriving, but all three are possible even after devastating trauma. Madison has become an advocate for victims of domestic violence and stalking, using her platform to raise awareness about warning signs and the importance of taking threats seriously. She connected with the family of Tristan Bailey, another Florida victim of youth violence, working to push for better protective measures. She documents her journey on social media, sharing her story not for attention but to inspire others facing their own battles. Her posts show the hard work of therapy, small victories, setbacks, and ultimately the fullness of a life being lived rather than merely endured. Spencer Pearson will spend the rest of his life in prison, his obsession having destroyed his own future as thoroughly as he tried to destroy Madison's. His case serves as a stark reminder of how dangerous inadequately treated mental health crises can be. Kennedy Armstrong and Jacqueline Roget both received the Carnegie Medal, one of North America's highest honors for civilian heroism. The recognition acknowledged two people whose split-second decisions and selfless actions saved a life. Madison herself is perhaps the person least impressed by her own achievements, viewing her recovery as simply doing what she had to do. But to everyone who knows her story, Madison Shemitz represents something profoundly important, proof that the human spirit can overcome even the most devastating attempts to break it. She walked when doctors said she never would. She smiled when she had every reason to despair. She chose hope when darkness seemed overwhelming. She transformed from victim to survivor to advocate, refusing to let Spencer Pearson's violence write the final chapter of her story. That is the true story of Madison Shemitz, not defined by the violence inflicted upon her, but by the strength she found within herself to overcome it. Her journey reminds us that we are not defined by what happens to us, but by how we respond, and Madison Shemitz responded with extraordinary courage, remarkable determination, and inspiring grace. Spencer Pearson gave Madison a sentence of paralysis and trauma, but Madison gave the world something far more valuable: proof that the human spirit can achieve what medical science says is impossible, and that violence doesn't have to have the final word.